The long road stretched before Silas Vance and Lillian Hayes, a dusty, endless ribbon leading back to the desolate confines of Vance's claim. The wagon wheels caught in deep ruts, sending up choking clouds of red dust that coated everything. Lillian held a delicate lace handkerchief over her mouth and nose, yet she offered no complaint, maintaining the rigid posture she had held since fleeing the platform at Solitude Pass. The immense sky pressed down upon them, a dome of relentless, blinding blue that offered no refuge from the afternoon's savage sun. As they cleared the final rise, Silas gestured ahead with a tilt of his head. There it is. The ranch spread before them, the gray weathered house, the barn, the few meager outbuildings, all of them brutally dwarfed by the sheer, overwhelming immensity of the prairie. He watched Lillian's face from the corner of his eye, seeing her absorb the isolation, the austere, unforgiving simplicity of her new reality. "It's very peaceful," she said quietly, her voice a low counterpoint to the endless wind. "It's lonely," he corrected, wanting no false expectations to stand between them, needing her to see the hardship, not some romanticized frontier dream. She turned her honey sage eyes to him then, steady and unwavering. "Sometimes, lonely is exactly what a person needs." The words struck deeper than she could have intended, resonating with a truth in Silas's own haunted soul. He urged the horses down the slope toward home. When they finally pulled up before the house, Lillian climbed down with an economy of movement before he could offer assistance. She stood for a long moment, one hand shading her eyes as she surveyed her new domain. The few remaining chickens scratched restlessly in their dusty pen. The small garden plot lay utterly barren, a casualty of the brutal drought and years of Silas's neglect. A loose board on the porch creaked, sounding like a lonely, drawn-out sigh in the heavy wind. "I'll fetch your trunk," Silas said, lifting the heavy case from the wagon bed. "I'll show you inside." The house felt instantly, unsettlingly smaller with her presence. Lillian moved through the main room, her steps silent on the worn floorboards, taking in the Spartan furnishings, the rough table, the two hard chairs, the wood stove, the shelves holding only the necessities. Everything was painfully clean, but utterly devoid of any warmth, a bachelor's dwelling, a shrine to solitude. "Your room is through here," he said, leading her to a small chamber off the main area. It held a narrow bed, a simple washstand, and a chest of drawers. It had been Alara's small sewing room. "It's small," he finished, choosing his words carefully, "but it's private." "It's fine." She placed her traveling hat on the bed, already assessing, calculating. "Where do you keep the water?" "There's a well out back. I'll show you." They walked the property as the sun began its brutal descent. He showed her the well, demonstrating the pump that now required a desperate, grinding effort to yield even a trickle of muddy water. She watched intently, asking no questions, her gaze missing nothing. At the chicken coop, she studied the gaunt hens with a professional, practical eye. "How many eggs do they lay?" "Not many lately. The heat stopped their laying." She nodded, filing the information away. At the dead garden plot, she knelt, sinking her fine fingers into the dry, cracked soil. "Nothing's grown here in 2 years," Silas stated, his voice heavy with defeat. "The soil isn't dead," she countered, standing and dusting her hands on her skirt. "Just thirsty. With enough work and water, something might grow again." The words hung between them, a potent metaphor neither chose to acknowledge. As darkness pressed in, she set about making supper with the meager supplies at hand. Silas sat at the table, ostensibly mending a bridle, but his eyes constantly tracked her movements. She worked with a quiet, fierce efficiency, finding what she needed, making do with what was available. Soon, the simple, honest smell of scorched beans and baking soda biscuits filled the room. They ate in silence, the oil lamp casting a narrow, trembling circle of yellow light that emphasized the vast, encroaching darkness beyond the window panes. The empty chair he'd once felt mocked him was now filled, but the reality was more acutely unnerving than the absence had ever been. She was too young, too beautiful, too much of everything he had tried to negate in his advertisement. "We should discuss the arrangements," he said finally, pushing his empty bowl aside. She met his gaze steadily. "What needs discussing?" "I want to be clear about expectations. I advertised for a wife." "Yes. But," he faltered, searching for words that would not trespass or offend, "this is a business arrangement, You'll have your room, I'll have mine. We'll work together to keep the ranch going, share the chores and duties, but I'm not expecting, that is, I won't require. I understand, she finished for him quietly, saving him from further embarrassing fumbling. You need a partner, not a wife in the true sense of the word. That suits me well enough. Relief, sharp and immediate, flooded through him, followed immediately by a confused, unwelcome sting of disappointment. He crushed both feelings instantly. The work's hard, he warned. Water has to be hauled, chickens fed, cows tended. There's cooking, washing, mending. Come winter, it's worse. Snow drifts high as the windows sometimes. We might be cut off from Solitude Pass for weeks. I am not afraid of work. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles east. Town's 15 miles. It's just us out here, most days. As I said, Mr. Vance, sometimes lonely is what a person needs. They cleared the table together, working in an awkward, unspoken tandem. When the dishes were put away, they sat again, the silence stretching between them, no longer comfortable, but humming with suppressed tension. I should tell you, Silas said slowly, staring into the flickering lamplight. The folks in town can be unkind. They've got their opinions about me, about anyone who doesn't fit their notion of proper. Now, with you here? He gestured vaguely at her radiant presence, looking like, well, they'll talk. They'll make assumptions. People always do, her voice carried a low, bitter edge. Beauty is its own curse, Mr. Vance. It makes people think they know you, think they have rights to you. I have learned to live with their assumptions. He wanted desperately to ask what had driven her here, what story lay behind those guarded, weary eyes. But they had agreed to a business arrangement, and personal histories were a currency too valuable, too dangerous for this transaction. We'll go to town once a week for supplies, he said instead, focusing on the practical. You don't have to come if you'd rather not face them. Hiding only makes the talk worse. She rose, smoothing her skirt. If you'll excuse me, it's been a long journey. He stood as well, suddenly aware of how the lamp's glow caught the pure gold strands in her hair. Of course, if you need anything, I'll manage. Good night, Mr. Vance. Silas, he said impulsively. If we're to work together, you should call me Silas. She paused at her door, her back to him. Good night, Silas. You may call me Lillian. After her door closed, he sat alone in the main room, listening to the small, intimate sounds of her settling in, the faint rustle of fabric, the splash of water in the basin, the protesting creak of the bed springs. Such ordinary sounds, yet they filled the house with a presence it hadn't known since Alara's passing. He thought of the town's reaction, the trouble that was guaranteed to follow. A woman like Lillian did not belong in this desolate, harsh place. Yet here she was, driven by whatever desperation had led her to answer his advertisement. He knew he should send her back, tell her it was a grave, terrible mistake. But the thought of returning to his solitary existence, now that he had tasted even this awkward, silent companionship, seemed utterly unbearable. He lay awake long into the night, acutely aware of her presence beyond the thin wall. He had wanted simple, he had wanted plain. Instead, he had gotten Lillian Hayes, with her beauty that would draw trouble like lightning to a conductor, and her deep secrets that lurked behind those steady eyes. The bargain he had struck suddenly felt fraught with dangers he had never foreseen, but it was done now. Come morning, they would begin the delicate, agonizing dance of two strangers learning to share a life while keeping their hearts safely, fiercely locked away. It was what they had both agreed to, what they both claimed to want. So why did it feel like they were both lying to the high desert sky? The drought deepened its hold with each passing day, turning the prairie into a dry, volatile tinderbox. Each dawn, Silas would check the sky for the merest hint of clouds, finding only the same cruel, empty blue. The ground was hard as iron, the grass lifeless, and the cattle grew gaunt, their ribs showing through dusty hides as they scoured the land for fresh grazing. Lillian had been at the ranch for 3 weeks, and a fragile, disciplined routine had taken hold. She rose before dawn to start the fire and prepare their meager breakfast while he tended the livestock. They worked separately through the long mornings, Silas checking fences and moving the weakened cattle, Lillian battling the endless fine dust that infiltrated every crack, tending the struggling chickens, and hauling water from the increasingly reluctant well. It was in the third week that the wolves began to circle closer. Silas first noticed their tracks near the outer pasture, significantly larger than any coyote. That evening, as the sun painted the horizon a desolate crimson, he saw them, three immense gray shadows moving with liquid silence along the ridge, watching the weakened cattle with patient, predatory hunger. "We'll need to keep watch tonight," he told Lillian over their simple supper of broth and stale bread. "The wolves are getting bold." She looked up from her bowl, her honey eyes steady. "I can shoot." The simple, unvarnished statement surprised him. "You can?" "My father taught me," she said, without looking away. "A woman alone needs to know how to protect herself." A shadow, brief and terrible, flickered in her expression. A memory quickly crushed. "I brought my rifle." That night, they took shifts standing watch. Silas took the first, his rifle resting across his knees on the porch. The wolves didn't show themselves, but he could feel them out there in the immense darkness, waiting for a lapse in vigilance. When Lillian came to relieve him at midnight, she was fully dressed, her hair tightly braided, the rifle cradled in her capable hands. "You should sleep," she said simply. "Dawn comes early." He hesitated. "If they come, I'll wake you." She took his place on the porch step, handling the weapon with an easy, unnerving familiarity. "Go on?" But sleep eluded him. Through his window, he watched her silhouette against the sharp, cold stars, alert and absolutely watchful. When a wolf howled in the distance, a long, tearing sound, she didn't flinch. When the cattle stirred nervously, she rose and walked the perimeter, her steps confident despite the concealing darkness. The attack came just before dawn. The wolves had waited for the turning of the shift, that moment when exhaustion is at its peak, but Lillian was still at her post when they flowed out of the darkness. Three shadows, moving like smoke toward the cattle pen. Her first shot cracked through the pre-dawn quiet, followed immediately by Silas bursting from the house, his own rifle ready. Lillian's shot had found its mark. One wolf lay still. The other two hesitated, hunger warring with caution. "The left one," Lillian said calmly, sighting down her barrel. They fired simultaneously. The wolf yelped and bolted, wounded but not dead. The third melted back into the darkness, unwilling to face two armed, coordinated defenders. As the sky lightened, they examined the dead wolf. Lillian's shot had been clean, precise, striking true. "Where did a woman learn to shoot like that?" Silas asked, a reluctant admiration tinging his voice. She was already turning away. "When you have something worth protecting, you learn." The incident shifted something between them. Silas found himself watching her with a reluctant, growing appreciation, not just for the raw, magnetic beauty he still tried to ignore, but for her competence. She worked without complaint, her soft hands growing calloused, her fine clothes replaced by practical, durable cotton. When the well pump finally seized, she helped him repair it. When a fence post needed replacing, she held it steady while he drove the spike deep into the recalcitrant ground. But the drought worsened. The well began to sputter, yielding only thick, muddy sludge. The main water barrel grew terrifyingly light. The cattle bellowed their anguish, and two of the weakest calves died despite their desperate efforts to save them. It was Lillian who finally suggested they dig a new well. "Where?" Silas asked, exhausted from another day of watching his life wither. "I've lived here 8 years. If there was water to be found, don't you think I'd have found it?" She led him to a spot near a small cluster of stunted cottonwoods, the only trees that survived for miles. "Here," she said, "see how these trees survive when everything else dies? Water runs deep here." He wanted to argue, to rail against the foolishness of the idea, but sheer desperation finally silenced him. They began digging the next morning, taking turns with a single shovel as the sun beat down on their backs. By noon, they were both drenched in sweat, covered in dust, and barely 3 feet down. "This is foolish," Silas gasped, leaning on the shovel's handle. Lillian took it from his hands. "Then be foolish with me." She dropped into the shallow hole and attacked the earth with fierce, almost furious determination. Her dress was instantly filthy, her hair escaping its pins, dirt streaking her beautiful face. She dug as if she could will water from the ground through sheer, unwavering stubbornness. By evening, they were 6 feet down and still in dry, unyielding earth. Silas's hands were raw with blisters. Lillian's were no better, though she'd wrapped them in torn strips of her petticoat. "Enough," Silas stated, defeated. "We'll kill ourselves for nothing." "One more foot," she insisted, her voice tight with effort. "Just one more." The shovel blade broke through to damp soil. Lillian let out a sharp cry of triumph that quickly dissolved into exhausted, dust-choked laughter. By full dark, they had struck water, not a torrent, but enough to prove her instinct profoundly right. They sat on the edge of the hole, dirty, broken, and oddly, strangely exhilarated. "How did you know?" Silas asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather had a touch for water, said it was about reading the land, feeling what it's trying to tell you." She looked at him sideways. "You think I'm talking nonsense?" "No," he said slowly. "No, I think you might have saved us." The moment stretched, charged with something far warmer, far more complicated than gratitude. Lillian's face was tilted toward him, starlight catching the wet sheen on her eyes. Silas felt himself leaning closer, drawn by a gravity stronger than any sense of duty or fear. Then, a coyote yipped in the distance, sharp and real, shattering the fragile spell. "We should go in," Lillian said, her voice unsteady. "Early morning tomorrow." As they walked back to the house, Silas wrestled with the sudden, unwelcome feeling stirring in his chest. He had been so careful to keep his heart buried, to treat her presence as purely practical. But seeing her today, fierce, determined, and covered in the very dust of his land, had cracked something vital open inside him. In Solitude Pass, the gossip machine was running at full, malicious throttle. Every weekly supply run brought a fresh torrent of whispers. Maureen Higgins had become a self-appointed oracle, spreading her corrosive theories about Lillian's past. The Cullen brothers made increasingly vulgar, bold comments whenever they thought Silas couldn't hear. Even Elder Davies had delicately suggested that perhaps Silas should bring his new bride to church to quell the sinful talk. But Lillian held her head high through it all, meeting their stares with cool, aristocratic dignity. She spoke when spoken to, ignored the whispers, and conducted herself with such unimpeachable propriety that even the worst gossip struggled to find fault beyond the unpardonable fact of her beauty. "Let them talk," she told Silas one evening after a particularly agonizing trip to town. "They'll tire of it eventually." But he could see the cost in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she unpinned her hat. Whatever demons had driven her to this hard, barren life, the town's relentless cruelty was wearing on her resolve. That night, the wolves returned, but this time, when Lillian took up her rifle for the watch, Silas stood beside her. "No need for you to lose sleep too," she said. "Partners share the burden," he replied, echoing her own words from weeks before. They stood side by side in the immense darkness, weapons ready, protecting what little they had left. And though neither would admit it aloud, they were protecting something else too. This fragile, new connection building between them, as delicate and precious as the first trickle of water from the well she had found. The storm came without warning on a late September night, rolling in from the mountains like an unleashed howling fury. Lightning violently split the sky while thunder shook the house to its foundations. Rain, the first desperately needed rain in months, hammered the roof with such violence that conversation became impossible. Silas had been mending harness leather when the first heavy drops struck. Lillian was darning one of his worn shirts, her needle moving in precise, careful stitches. They both looked up at the sound, hardly daring to believe the miracle. "Rain," Lillian breathed, setting aside her work. They rushed to the porch together, watching as the parched, starving earth drank deep. The rich, clean smell of wet soil and sage filled the air, a scent of profound promise. Lillian stepped out into the savage downpour, spreading her arms wide, her face turned up to the deluge. The rain instantly plastered her dress to her body, turning her meticulously pinned hair into streaming ribbons of wet gold. "Come inside," Silas shouted over the drumming roar. "You'll catch your death." But she laughed, the first sound of pure, unadulterated joy he had ever heard from her, and spun in the rain like a child. Something in that moment utterly demolished Silas's careful defenses. She was so alive, so radiantly happy, that his heart constricted painfully in his chest. A crack of lightning, impossibly close, sent them both scrambling inside. They stood dripping in the doorway, Lillian still laughing breathlessly. Her eyes met his, bright with rain and exhilarating life, and the air between them crackled with more than just the storm's electricity. "You're soaked through," he said roughly, grabbing a blanket from a chair. As he draped it around her shoulders, their bodies came close, closer than they had ever allowed. She looked up at him, water droplets clinging to her lashes, and he found himself utterly drowning in those deep, mesmerizing depths. His hand lingered on the wool blanket, trembling slightly. "Silas," she whispered, and in her voice he heard a terrifying echo of his own deep, suppressed longing. Thunder crashed overhead, making them both jump, and the spell was violently broken. Lillian clutched the blanket tighter and retreated quickly to her room to change. Silas stood alone, his fists clenched, battling the terrifying desire that threatened to consume his carefully constructed solitude. When she emerged in dry clothes, they sat before the fire he had hastily built to chase away the storm's damp chill. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had gone unspoken for weeks. "I should tell you something," Lillian said finally, her voice barely audible above the rain's drumming on the roof. "About why I came here." Silas waited, not trusting himself to speak, knowing this was the moment of truth. "I was engaged once," she began, her hands twisting in her lap, "to a wealthy man back in Missouri, Alistair Finch. Her father had owed Finch a huge sum in gambling debts. When the father couldn't pay, Finch offered the solution. Me. I thought I could bear it. I told myself many women marry without love. But Alistair—" She paused, choosing her words with clinical precision. "He saw beauty as something to own, to display, like a prize horse or a painting. The wedding preparations went on for months. Everyone told me how fortunate I was." "What happened?" Silas asked quietly. "The night before the wedding, I overheard him talking to his partners, laughing about how he'd won the prettiest filly in 3 counties, how he intended to break me to bridle like his horses." Her voice was laced with pure venom. "That was when I understood. I wasn't to be a wife. I was to be a possession." Lightning illuminated her face, revealing the tears she had refused to let fall. "So, I ran, took what little money I could find, and fled west. I answered several advertisements before yours, but the men who responded," she shuddered, "they all wanted a pretty ornament, just like Alistair." "Then I read your letter," she finished, looking him directly in the eye. "You specifically wanted someone plain. I thought perhaps you'd be different. You wouldn't see me as a prize." "But I wasn't," Silas said, self-loathing thick in his voice. "The moment I saw you, I feared—" "You feared desire. So did I." She turned to face him fully. "Don't you see? That's why I felt safe answering your advertisement. A man who wanted a plain wife wouldn't see me as a prize to be won." "You're not safe," Silas said harshly, his control breaking. "Not for me, not anymore." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Every day it gets harder, watching you work, seeing your strength, your kindness. Tonight, in the rain." He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. "I'm no better than him, wanting what I shouldn't want." "You're nothing like him," Lillian rose, crossing to stand behind him. "You've never tried to own me, never treated me as less than human. We've been partners. True partners." "Partners don't feel what I feel," he said to the pain. "What do you feel?" He turned then, finding her dangerously close. "Things I swore I'd never feel again. Things that terrify me more than drought or wolves or ruin." "I feel them too," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Late at night, I lie awake listening to you move in your room. When our hands touch at dinner, I burn for hours after. Is that wrong? Are we betraying our arrangement?" "Yes," he said, even as he reached up to cup her face with his calloused hands. "This wasn't supposed to happen. Nothing in life happens as it's supposed to." She leaned into his touch. "I came here running from one prison, thinking I'd found safety in loneliness. Instead, I found—" He kissed her then, unable to resist the gravity between them any longer. She melted against him, all her careful walls crumbling into ash. The storm outside seemed only an echo of the violent tempest raging in their hearts, wild, dangerous, necessary as rain to the parched earth. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, reality crashed back. "This changes everything," Silas said. "Or nothing," Lillian countered. "We can pretend this didn't happen, go back to our arrangement." But they both knew that was a lie. The dam had broken. There would be no rebuilding it. The next morning, the question hung between them, heavy and raw. What were they to each other now? The stranger arrived on a Thursday morning, cutting across the Vance land on a black thoroughbred that gleamed with expensive care. Silas was repairing the chicken coop when he heard the measured, unfamiliar cadence of the approaching hoofbeats. He straightened, hammer in hand. The rider was everything Silas was not. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than the ranch's entire annual profit. His face was handsome in a cold, hard way, with pale, assessing eyes that swept the property with an unnerving proprietary interest before settling on Silas. "You'd be Vance," the man said, his voice carrying the polished assurance of wealth. It wasn't a question. "I am, and you're on my land?" The stranger smiled, a chilling expression that did not touch his eyes. "Alistair Finch, I believe you have something that belongs to me." Silas's grip tightened on the hammer handle. "Nothing here belongs to you. We'll see about that." Finch dismounted with practiced ease, tying his horse to the fence post as if he were taking possession of the place. "Where is she? If you're looking for someone, try town. This is private property. Come now, Vance, we both know Lillian's here. The whole territory knows about the beautiful bride who answered your pathetic advertisement." Finch pulled out a cigar, taking his time lighting it. "Caused quite a stir, I'm told. A woman like that choosing a man like you." The kitchen door opened. Lillian emerged, carrying the water bucket. She froze at the sight of Finch, the color draining instantly from her face. The bucket slipped from her numb fingers, water splashing across the dusty ground. "Hello, Lillian," Finch said, his tone sickeningly pleasant. "You've led me quite a chase." "You have no right to be here," she managed, but her voice was a fragile tremor. "On the contrary, I have every right. We have an agreement, you and I, a contract signed by your father, legally binding." He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket. "You're my property, bought and paid for." "I am no one's property," Lillian asserted, lifting her chin despite the terror in her eyes. "The law says otherwise. Your father's debts, remember? $20,000. I paid them in exchange for you. That makes you mine." Silas stepped forward, placing himself between them. "The lady is my wife now. Any claim you had is void." Finch laughed, a short, sharp sound of pure contempt. "Wife? I think not. I've made inquiries. No marriage certificate filed in this county, no church ceremony, just two people living in sin as far as the law is concerned. Get off my land." Silas's voice was quiet, deadly. "Or what?" Finch blew smoke lazily into the air. "You'll shoot me? Beat me with that hammer?" "I don't think so. You're not that kind of man, Vance. Too civilized, too weak." His pale eyes slid past Silas to Lillian. "That's why she felt safe here, isn't it? Hiding behind a man who doesn't have the spine to fight for her." Silas's fist connected with Finch's jaw before anyone could react. The bigger man stumbled back, more surprised than hurt. He touched his lip, saw the blood, and his expression darkened into a cold mask of rage. "That was a mistake," he said softly. The mistake was coming here. Silas's stance had shifted. He was no longer the quiet rancher, but something harder, forged in the crucible of loss and fear. "Leave now?" Finch straightened his suit coat. "I'll be back with the sheriff, the judge, whoever it takes. That woman is mine by law, and I will have her. Enjoy your time together, Vance. It won't last long." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the heavy scent of cigar smoke and menace lingering in the air. Lillian sank to her knees in the spilled water. Silas knelt beside her, but she flinched when he tried to touch her. $20,000, she whispered. "I didn't know it was so much. I didn't know he'd—" She looked up at Silas with desperate, frantic eyes. "I'll leave tonight. I won't bring this trouble to you." "You're not going anywhere." "You don't understand. Alistair has connections everywhere. Judges, lawmen, politicians. He'll destroy you to get to me. You said yourself you wouldn't risk another loss. Well, here it is. The loss is coming for you. Let me go before—" He pulled her against him, cutting off her panicked protests. "I've been a coward," he said into her hair, his voice rough with emotion, "hiding behind my grief, using Alara's death as an excuse to stop living. But you changed that. You made me want things again, feel things again." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes burning with resolve. "I won't let fear rule me anymore. Not his, not mine." That afternoon, they rode to Solitude Pass together. The news had already spread. Finch had made sure of it. Sheriff Morrison was waiting outside his office, badge glinting in the harsh sun. Beside him stood Judge Carter, and beside the judge, Finch himself, looking satisfied and coiled. "Vance," the sheriff said, not unkindly, "we need to sort this out, legal-like." "Nothing to sort," Silas replied. "Lillian is my wife, with or without papers." Judge Carter adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Finch has shown me a legal contract. Unless you can prove a prior claim—" "How much?" Silas interrupted, cutting through the formalities. Finch's eyes sharpened. "Pardon?" "The debt. How much to clear?" "It— $20,000 plus interest. Call it $25,000 even." A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. It was more money than most would see in 10 lifetimes. "I don't have that kind of money," Silas said. "But I have land, cattle, everything I own against the debt." "No, Silas, no!" Lillian cried, grabbing his arm. "The ranch is everything to you." "No," he said, looking at her, his meaning absolute. "You are." Finch considered the offer. "The ranch is worth maybe $10,000 if we're generous. Not nearly enough. Then we settle this another way." Silas's hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt. "You and me, winner takes all." The crowd pulled back instantly. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, but Judge Carter stopped him with a raised hand. "It's legal," the judge said slowly. "Mutual combat to settle a dispute, as long as both parties agree." Finch smiled, a predator's expression. "You're not a gunfighter, Vance. You're a rancher who's held a weapon maybe twice in anger. I've killed 7 men in fair fights. You'd be number 8. Then you have nothing to worry about." "Silas, please," Lillian whispered. "This is what he wants, another death on his hands." But Silas's mind was set. "Tomorrow, noon, middle of Main Street, I'll be there." Finch agreed, his voice laced with cold triumph. "And when you're dead, Lillian comes with me. No more running, no more hiding." That night, Lillian paced the ranch house like a trapped animal. "There has to be another way. We could leave tonight, head for California, spend our lives looking over our shoulders." Silas was calm, cleaning his revolver with methodical care. "No, this ends tomorrow, one way or another." "You'll die for nothing. For pride?" "Not for pride." He set the gun aside and took her hands. "For the right to love you without fear, for the chance to build a life without his shadow over us. That is worth any risk." She kissed him then, desperately, violently, as if trying to memorize the very taste of him. When they broke apart, tears streamed down her cheeks. "I love you," she said, the words choked with pain. "I should have said it before." "Tell me tomorrow," he said. "After." But they both knew there might not be an after. In 12 hours, one of them would be planning a funeral. The morning of the duel dawned clear and still, as if the high desert sky itself held its breath. Silas rose before first light. His hands were steady as he strapped on his gun belt, though his heart hammered a heavy, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. Lillian stood in the doorway, her face pale but fierce. "I won't watch you die," she said flatly. "Then watch me live." He framed her face with his hands. "Have faith in me, Lillian. In us. Faith won't stop a bullet. No, but fear won't either." He kissed her forehead. "Whatever happens, know that these weeks with you have been worth everything." They rode to town in silence, Lillian rigid beside him. As they neared Main Street, they saw the crowd already gathering. Finch was waiting outside the saloon, his black clothes making him look like the embodiment of death. He checked his pocket watch. 20 minutes to noon, Vance. Still time to reconsider. Sign over the ranch, let Lillian honor her obligations, and walk away breathing." "No." Sheriff Morrison stood between the two men, a white handkerchief in his hand. "When I drop this handkerchief, you draw and fire. First man down loses. Any man who draws early will be shot where he stands." Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. Silas could hear the deep, thudding pulse in his own ears. He found Lillian in the crowd, her eyes wide, fierce, and unwavering, and that gaze gave him strength. The handkerchief fluttered in the sheriff's hand. Finch's stance shifted, the move of a practiced killer. His hand would be impossibly quick. The handkerchief fell. Finch's hand moved like lightning, his gun clearing leather in a blur. The crack of his shot split the air, but Silas had already moved, stepping sideways as he drew, using a trick learned not from gunfighting, but from years of dodging a charging bull. Finch's bullet sang past his ear. Silas's gun came up slower, but steadier, and he fired. The bullet caught Finch high in the shoulder, spinning him around. His gun fell from nerveless fingers as he dropped to one knee, clutching the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, but he was alive. "Kill me, then!" Finch gasped, looking up with raw hatred. "Finish it!" Silas walked forward, his gun still trained. The crowd held its breath, expecting the finishing shot. "No," Silas said, holstering his weapon with a loud clack. "You'll live, but you'll leave today. And if you ever come near Lillian again, I won't miss your heart next time. The debt dies with your claim to her." Silas pulled a paper from his vest, a marriage certificate, dated that morning. "We were married at dawn by Elder Davies, legal and binding. Any claim you had is void." Finch's face contorted with a mixture of rage and pain. "You think this ends it? I have friends, influence." Silas turned his back on the fallen man, walking toward Lillian. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms with a sharp sob. "You knew," she whispered against his chest. "You knew he'd aim for your heart." "Alara's father was a gunfighter before he found God," Silas admitted, holding her tight. "Taught me a few things about reading a man's intentions. Finch kills men the same way. Quick draw, heart shot. He's predictable." They walked back to their wagon through the parted, silent crowd. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked at Lillian with new eyes, not as a scandal or a prize, but as a woman who had inspired a man to risk everything. As they rode home, Lillian leaned against his shoulder. "What you said back there, about everything to lose, was true." He took her hand, feeling the cheap wedding band they had placed there that morning. "I spent 3 years thinking I had nothing left to lose. Then you arrived and showed me I was wrong. I had my fear to lose, my loneliness, my walls. Losing those things to gain you was the best trade I ever made." The house that had once seemed so empty now felt like home. They had won more than a duel today. They had won the right to love without fear, to build a life without shadows. "I love you," Lillian said as they stood on the porch, looking out at the land they had both fought for. "I love you," he replied, "my unexpected wife, my chosen life." He swept her into his arms, carrying her over the threshold. The duel was over. The real life, messy, difficult, glorious, was just beginning. The weeks that followed brought deep, lasting changes to Vance's claim. The isolation that had once defined the ranch began to thaw. Lillian threw herself into transforming the house into a true home. She coaxed the barren garden back to life with patient, steady tending. The new well she had instinctively found proved reliable, a profound symbol of their partnership. One morning, as autumn painted the prairie in rust and gold, Silas found Lillian standing by Alara's grave on the hill. She had a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. "I wanted to pay my respects," she said softly without turning. Silas stood beside her. "She was lucky," Lillian said, "to be so loved, to be mourned so deeply. You didn't bring that part of me back to life, Silas. You grew something new in its place, something stronger." She laid the flowers on the simple grave. In town, Lillian's standing had fundamentally changed. The scandalous beauty had become a legend. She was the brave woman who had inspired a man to face death for her freedom. Sheriff Morrison confirmed that Finch had fled the territory, selling his interests and heading back east, utterly defeated. As winter approached, they worked side by side, preparing for the cold. The barn was reinforced, hay stocked high, the root cellar filled. One evening, as snow began to fall in fat, silent flakes, they sat before the fire, planning for spring. The drought had broken, and the ranch, with careful management, could prosper again. They talked late into the night, their dreams growing larger with each shared word. Children were mentioned, tentatively at first, then with quiet, profound excitement. The empty rooms upstairs could be filled with laughter. No more mail-order brides, though, Lillian teased, leaning her head on his shoulder. Our daughters will choose their own paths, Silas agreed. And our sons will know how to respect a woman's choices. He pulled her close. Do you ever regret it? Answering that advertisement? Every choice I made led me here, she said simply. How could I regret the path that brought me home? He thought of his own journey, the crushing grief, the desperate letter asking for plainness, the fear when beauty arrived instead of simplicity. All of it necessary. All of it perfectly imperfect. I love you, he said, words that came easily now. And I love you, she replied. They made their way upstairs, no longer to separate rooms, but to the bed they now shared, their union sealed by storm, shovel, and the smoke of a duel. The man who had expected a plain bride had received so much more. She hadn't been what he'd ordered, but she had been what he needed. Together, they transformed a business arrangement into a love story worthy of the wild, unforgiving frontier that had witnessed its birth. In the warmth of their bed, Silas and Lillian Vance faced a future without fear, knowing that whatever challenges awaited, they would meet them hand in hand. Dawn would break soon over the Wyoming prairie, painting the new snow in shades of rose and gold. A new day and a new life, built on courage and the realization that sometimes what we think we want and what we truly need are as different as drought and rain, and just as necessary for growth.